March 1945. A flight of Allied bombers, bleeding fuel and riddled with flak, descends into German-held airspace with no altitude to spare. The lead pilot is unconscious. The co-pilot is 19 years old, barely 3 months out of training, and has never landed under fire. In the next 90 seconds, he will either become a footnote in a casualty report or rewrite the manual on what one person can do when every system fails. What he does next defies every instructor who doubted him. The winter of early 1945 stretches cold and unforgiving across the European theater. Snow dusts the runways of American bomber bases scattered throughout England and liberated France. The air smells of oil, exhaust, and damp wool. Briefing rooms echo with the scrape of chairs and the low rumble of men too tired to joke anymore. By now, the war has been grinding forward for years. The Allies are pushing into Germany from the west. The Soviets press from the east. But victory is not clean. It is purchased in aluminum and blood, sortie by sortie, mission by grinding mission. The bomber war demands precision. Formations of B-17s and B-24s cross enemy lines in daylight, flying through curtains of flak and swarms of Luftwaffe interceptors. The logic is simple. Destroy the factories, the fuel depots, the rail yards, cripple the infrastructure, starve the war machine. But simplicity ends at the briefing table. Once airborne, everything becomes chaos. Engines fail, oxygen systems freeze, fighters tear through formations like scissors through silk, anti-aircraft fire bursts in black clouds that rattle teeth and punch through wings. Men bleed out at 20,000 feet, too high and too cold for mercy. The crews are young. Most are still in their teens or early 20s. They come from farms in Iowa, factories in Detroit, classrooms in Pennsylvania. They learn to fly heavy machines in a matter of months. Then they are thrust into the sky over hostile territory with 10 other lives depending on their judgment. Some adapt quickly. They become the confident ones, the natural pilots who seem born with a stick in their hands. Others are quieter. They do their jobs, follow orders, stay out of the way. They are competent but unremarkable. They do not draw attention. Second Lieutenant James Calloway falls into the latter category. He arrives at his assigned unit in late 1944, fresh from stateside training. His records show solid marks, but nothing exceptional. His instructors note that he is methodical, sometimes slow to react, and overly cautious during simulated emergencies. One evaluation reads, lacks confidence under pressure, needs encouragement. Another, technically sound but hesitant, unsuited for command roles. He does not argue with these assessments. He keeps his head down. He listens more than he speaks. In the barracks, the other men joke and argue and gamble away their pay. Calloway reads technical manuals. He sketches diagrams of hydraulic systems and engine schematics in a worn notebook. He asks the crew chiefs questions about trim settings and fuel management that most pilots never bother with. The flight engineers tolerate him. The other pilots mostly ignore him. He is assigned as a co-pilot on a B-24 Liberator, a position that requires competence but rarely demands brilliance. His job is to assist, to monitor, to be a backup. He does it quietly. His pilot, Captain Robert Hale, is everything Calloway is not. Hale is 24, but carries himself like a man a decade older. He has flown 32 missions. He laughs easily, drinks hard, and flies with an edge of recklessness that his crew interprets as confidence. They trust him because he always brings them home. Hale does not trust Calloway. Not yet. To him, the shy co-pilot is a liability waiting to happen, someone who will freeze when the moment demands action. Hale does not say this aloud, but Calloway can feel it in the way orders are delivered, in the brief glances during pre-flight checks. It is the quiet judgment of a man who has seen too many hesitations turn fatal. Calloway does not resent this, he simply works. He double-checks fuel calculations. He memorizes emergency procedures until they play in his sleep. He studies the terrain maps, the weather reports, the debriefings from other crews. He absorbs everything. On the morning of March 14, 1945, the mission briefing is routine. The target is a synthetic oil refinery near Leipzig, deep inside Germany. Intelligence reports moderate flak and possible fighter activity. The weather is expected to be overcast but manageable. The formation will consist of 18 bombers, escorted partway by P-51 Mustangs. Hale's crew boards their B-24, tail number 427563, nicknamed Lucky Streak by a crew that flew her before them. The name is fading now, barely visible under layers of grime and patches. Calloway settles into the right seat. He runs through his checklist with mechanical precision. Engine start, gauge check, flap setting, trim adjustment. The engines cough, then roar to life. The airframe shudders. Frost cracks and slides off the wings as the propellers spin up. One by one, the bombers taxi toward the runway. They lift off just after dawn. The sky is pale gray, heavy with clouds. The formation climbs, tightening into a defensive box. The Mustangs join them at 10,000 feet, sleek and fast, weaving above the lumbering bombers like sheepdogs around a flock. For 2 hours, the mission proceeds without incident. The cloud cover thickens, the temperature drops. Ice begins to form on the windscreen. Calloway watches the instruments, calling out readings every few minutes. Hale nods, but says little. Then the flak starts. It begins as distant black puffs, almost decorative. Then it tightens. The gunners on the ground have the range now. Explosions bloom closer, louder. Shrapnel pings against the fuselage. One burst rocks the plane hard to the left. Hale fights the yoke, bringing her level again. A voice crackles over the intercom. "Number 3 engine hit. Oil pressure dropping." Hale feathers the prop, shutting down the damaged engine. The bomber loses speed, begins to drift back from the formation. The other planes pull ahead. Then the fighters come. 2 Focke-Wulf 190s, gray ghosts against gray clouds. They dive from above, cannon fire stitching across the wing. The waist gunners return fire, tracers lacing the sky. One fighter peels away, the other presses in. A burst strikes the cockpit, the plexiglass spiderwebs. Wind screams through the opening. Hale jerks violently, then slumps forward against his harness. Calloway reaches for him, shouts his name. No response. Blood spreads dark across Hale's jacket. The bomber begins to nose down. If you want more such stories, like and subscribe so these lives aren't forgotten. Time does not slow. That is a myth. But focus narrows. The world collapses to a series of decisions, each one demanding immediate action. Calloway pulls Hale back from the controls. The captain's weight is dead, his hands slack. There is no time to check vitals, no time to call for the navigator or bombardier to help. The bomber is diving, picking up speed, the altimeter unwinding fast. Calloway grabs the yoke with both hands. He pulls. The plane resists, momentum and gravity conspiring against him. His arms burn. The nose rises, slowly, grudgingly. The dive flattens into a shallow descent. He levels off at 14,000 feet. His breath comes hard and fast, fogging the cold air inside the shattered cockpit. Wind howls through the broken glass. Ice crystals sting his face. He keys the intercom. His voice is steadier than he expects. "Pilot incapacitated. I have control. Damage report." The responses come in fragments. Number 3, engine out. Number 2, running rough. Hydraulics compromised, left stabilizer damaged, fuel leaking from the main tank. They are alone now. The formation is gone, vanished into the clouds ahead. The fighters have broken off, perhaps hunting easier prey. The bomber limns through hostile sky, losing altitude, losing fuel, losing time. The navigator's voice crackles through. "We're 60 miles inside enemy territory. Heading 270 puts us back toward friendly lines, but we won't make it on 2 engines with this damage." Calloway scans the horizon. Below, through breaks in the clouds, he sees the patchwork of fields and villages, the dark lines of roads and rail. All of it enemy ground. The bombardier suggests bailing out. They still have altitude. They could scatter, take their chances on foot. Some might evade capture. Calloway considers this. 9 men aboard, some wounded. The radio operator took shrapnel in the leg. The tail gunner is unconscious, maybe dead. Bailing out means leaving them. He makes the decision without drama. "We're staying with the ship. Prepare for emergency landing." No one argues. Perhaps they trust him. Perhaps they simply have no better option. He begins a shallow turn westward. The engines groan. The airframe shudders. Every control input feels sluggish, as if the plane itself is dying by degrees. They descend through 10,000 feet, then 8, then 6. The clouds thin. The ground rises to meet them, no longer abstract, but immediate. He can see individual trees now, the rooftops of barns, the glint of a frozen stream. The navigator calls out landmarks, trying to orient them. They are over farmland, somewhere south of the main combat lines. No safe airfield within range. No flat ground visible. Calloway's mind runs through options with mechanical speed. Wheels up landing in a field, risky with damaged hydraulics and uneven terrain. Trying to gain altitude and head for Allied lines. Impossible with their fuel state and engine condition. Attempting to reach neutral territory. Too far. Then he sees it. A stretch of road, straight and wide, cutting through a valley. It is not long, perhaps half a mile. It is not empty. A convoy of German trucks is moving along it, headed south. But it is the only option. He tells the crew to brace. He does not explain the plan because there is no time and no alternative. He drops the landing gear manually, cranking the handle until his shoulders scream. The gear locks with a thud he feels more than hears. The road rushes up. He lines up the approach, fighting crosswind and the plane's tendency to drift left. The trucks scatter, pulling off into the ditches. Soldiers pour out, scattering into the fields. Some raise rifles. Calloway ignores them. He focuses on the pavement, on the airspeed, on the angle of descent. Too steep, and they will cartwheel. Too shallow, and they will overshoot into the tree line. He cuts power to the remaining engines. The bomber drops. The wheels kiss the road surface, bounce hard, slam down again. The fuselage shrieks as metal scrapes pavement. The left tire blows. The plane yaws violently. He fights it, using rudder and brakes, dragging the crippled machine straight. They slide for 300 yards. The right wing clips a telephone pole, spinning them 15 degrees. The tail swings around. Then, finally, they stop. Silence. For a moment, no one moves. Then the intercom erupts with voices. Someone is laughing. Someone is praying. Someone is screaming for the medic. Calloway unbuckles, stumbles out of his seat. His hands are shaking now, the adrenaline catching up. He moves through the fuselage, checking faces, counting heads. 8 men alive. The tail gunner did not make it. Through the broken windows he sees German soldiers approaching, weapons raised but not firing. There is nowhere to run. They are deep in enemy territory, surrounded, their plane a smoking wreck on a country road. The crew begins to raise their hands. The war, for them, is over. But they are alive, all of them who could be saved. Prisoner of war camps are not the subject of this story. What matters is what came after, or rather, what came to light afterward. The crew of Lucky Streak spent the final weeks of the war in a Luftwaffe-run facility near Nuremberg. Conditions were grim, but not brutal. The German guards, many of them older men or boys too young for the front, were exhausted and increasingly aware that the war was lost. They processed the new prisoners with bureaucratic efficiency and little malice. Calloway shared a barracks with 30 other captured airmen. They passed the days playing cards, sharing Red Cross parcels, and listening to distant artillery that grew louder each week. No one knew exactly when liberation would come, only that it was inevitable. During those weeks, Calloway spoke little about the emergency landing. When the other prisoners asked, he described it in technical terms: airspeed, angle of descent, control surface response. He did not frame it as heroism. To him, it was a problem that required a solution. He had found the only viable one. But the crew of Lucky Streak did not see it that way. They talked among themselves, reconstructing the sequence of events. The navigator calculated that they had been descending at a rate that would have put them into the ground in under 2 minutes. The bombardier remembered the way Calloway had cranked the landing gear down manually, a task that usually required 2 men. The radio operator, still limping from his shrapnel wound, recalled the calm voice on the intercom, giving orders without hesitation. They began to understand what had happened. Their quiet, unremarkable co-pilot had done something extraordinary, and he had done it alone. In late April, American forces overran the camp. The prisoners were loaded onto trucks and driven west, back across the lines they had once bombed from above. They were debriefed, examined, and processed. Most were sent home within weeks. Calloway returned to the United States in May 1945. The war in Europe was over. Japan would surrender 3 months later. He was discharged with the rest of the wartime pilots, his service record noting 1 emergency landing under combat conditions. There was no medal, no ceremony. The Air Force was demobilizing millions. Paperwork was lost. Stories went untold. He went back to Ohio. He finished a degree in mechanical engineering. He married. He took a job with an aircraft manufacturer, working in design and testing. He did not talk about the war, but the story did not end there. In 1947, the Air Force began a comprehensive review of emergency procedures and pilot training. The war had revealed gaps in doctrine, moments where standard procedures failed and crews had to improvise or die. The goal was to identify what had worked, codify it, and teach it to the next generation. A researcher at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base came across the after-action report from Lucky Streak's final mission. The details were sparse but striking. A co-pilot with minimal command experience had successfully landed a crippled bomber on a narrow road deep in enemy territory, saving 8 lives in the process. The researcher requested additional files. He found the debriefing transcripts from the surviving crew members. He tracked down the maintenance logs from the bomber's previous missions. He interviewed the navigator and the bombardier, both of whom were still in the service. What emerged was a portrait of an unorthodox solution to an impossible problem. Calloway had not followed standard procedure. Standard procedure would have been to bail out. Instead, he had assessed the specific variables, his crew's condition, the terrain, the fuel state, and made a calculated gamble. More importantly, he had done something that training did not emphasize. He had used the environment itself as a resource. The road was not an airfield, but it was flat and straight. It was occupied, but that also meant it was maintained. He had turned an obstacle into an opportunity. The report became a case study, It was circulated through training commands. Instructors began using it to illustrate adaptive thinking under pressure. The lesson was not that pilots should land on roads. The lesson was that doctrine could not cover every scenario, and that the best pilots were those who could recognize when the rules no longer applied. Calloway never knew about this. He was not contacted. His name appeared in internal documents, but not in public accounts. The Air Force did not publicize individual cases from the war unless they involved high-profile heroics or strategic significance. A single emergency landing, however impressive, did not meet that threshold. But among a small community of test pilots, flight instructors, and aviation engineers, the story circulated. It became a touchstone. When someone questioned whether a maneuver was possible, someone else would mention the co-pilot who landed a B-24 on a German road. The details varied in the retelling, but the core remained. One person, under impossible conditions, had refused to accept the obvious outcome. In 1953, James Calloway was working at Lockheed's facility in Burbank, California. His job involved stress testing for new airframes, the kind of meticulous, unglamorous work that kept planes from falling apart at altitude. He was good at it. His colleagues respected him. He still did not talk about the war. One afternoon, an Air Force colonel visited the facility. He was there to consult on a project involving emergency ejection systems. During a meeting, he mentioned a training case study about a wartime landing. He did not use names, only the broad strokes: a crippled bomber, a narrow road, a co-pilot who had never commanded a plane in combat. Someone in the room asked if anyone knew who the pilot had been. The colonel did not. The records had been filed under the aircraft's tail number, not the crew names. It was a story, not a biography. Calloway said nothing. He let the conversation move on. Later, a colleague approached him. The man had flown B-24s during the war and knew Calloway's service record. He asked quietly if it had been him. Calloway nodded. The colleague asked why he had never mentioned it. Calloway's answer was simple. It seemed like what anyone would have done, but that was not true, and both men knew it. Most pilots, faced with the same situation, would have ordered a bailout. It was the logical choice. It was what training dictated. Staying with a dying aircraft over enemy territory was a gamble that defied reason. Except Calloway had understood something others might not have. His crew was injured, disoriented, and scattered across the fuselage. Bailing out in enemy territory with wounded men would have meant capture or death for most of them. The odds of survival were better if they stayed together, if they put the plane down intact. It was not heroism, it was arithmetic. But arithmetic performed under fire, with seconds to decide, required a kind of clarity that few people possess. The colleague pressed further. Had Calloway been afraid? Terrified, he admitted, but that didn't change what needed to be done. This is the core of his story, not fearlessness, but function despite fear, not instinct, but deliberate thought compressed into moments. Years later, historians would try to reconstruct his decision-making process. They would interview the surviving crew members, now old men with fading memories. They would analyze the flight data, the weather reports, the terrain maps. They would build models and run simulations, testing whether the landing was skill or luck. The consensus? Both. The road was there, which was luck. But recognizing it, lining up the approach, and executing the landing with damaged controls was skill. Remove either element and the crew dies. But Calloway himself never framed it that way. When asked, decades later, how he had known what to do, he said only that he had spent a lot of time reading manuals, that he had paid attention to the crew chiefs, that he had asked questions others found tedious. In other words, he had prepared. Not for that specific crisis, but for the idea that crisis was inevitable. He had built a foundation of knowledge so that when the moment came, he did not have to invent a solution from nothing. He only had to recognize which pieces fit. This is the overlooked aspect of wartime innovation. It is rarely a flash of genius. It is usually the result of unglamorous preparation, of someone who took the time to understand systems deeply enough that they could improvise when those systems failed. The recognition came late, almost too late. In 1998, a military historian named Dr. Ellen Pritchard was researching a book on unheralded moments of the air war. She had access to newly declassified files and a network of veteran contacts. One of them mentioned the Lucky Streak case study, which was still being used in modified form at the Air Force Academy. Pritchard tracked down the original after-action report. She cross-referenced it with crew records and found James Calloway's name. A search revealed that he was still alive, living in Arizona, retired from a long career in aerospace engineering. She wrote to him. He did not respond. She called. He politely declined to be interviewed. She tried a different approach. She contacted the surviving crew members. Only 2 were still alive. One, the navigator, had kept a diary during his time as a POW. In it, he had written about the landing in vivid detail. He described Calloway's hands on the yoke, the way his voice had stayed level over the intercom, the impossible geometry of a heavy bomber threading onto a country road. The navigator agreed to an interview. He spoke for 2 hours, his memory sharp on details from 50 years prior. He described the other pilots in their unit, the ones who were confident and loud, the ones everyone assumed would be heroes. And then he described Calloway, the quiet one, the one they had all underestimated. "We mocked him," the navigator said. "Not cruelly, but we didn't take him seriously. He was too cautious, too slow. We thought he'd freeze when it mattered." Instead, he had been the only one who did not freeze. Armed with this testimony, Pritchard wrote to Calloway again. This time, she included excerpts from the navigator's account. She explained that she was not interested in glorification, only accuracy. She wanted to understand how someone with his training record had performed so far beyond expectations. Calloway replied. He agreed to a single meeting on the condition that it remain private until after his death. They met in his home in Scottsdale. He was 76, still sharp, still precise in his speech. He walked her through the mission step by step, using diagrams he sketched on a notepad. He explained his reasoning at each decision point. He noted where he had been lucky, where he had miscalculated, where he had simply acted on instinct because there was no time for thought. Pritchard asked the question that mattered most. Why had he stayed calm when everything was falling apart? Calloway paused. Then he said something she would later use as the closing line of her book. Because panic is just noise, and noise doesn't solve problems. He died in 2003. Pritchard's book was published the following year. It included a full chapter on the Lucky Streak mission. The Air Force read it. So did veterans groups, aviation historians, and flight schools. In 2005, the Air Force formally recognized Calloway's actions. A medal was issued posthumously. His family accepted it at a small ceremony at Wright-Patterson. The citation noted his exceptional airmanship and decisiveness under combat conditions. But the more meaningful recognition came elsewhere. The case study, which had been taught for decades in anonymized form, was updated to include his name. New pilots at the Air Force Academy read about Second Lieutenant James Calloway, the co-pilot who was too cautious, too quiet, too slow, until the moment when caution became precision and quietness became clarity. His story became a counter-narrative to the mythos of the natural-born fighter ace. He was not a maverick. He was not reckless. He succeeded because he had done the unsexy work of preparation, because he had treated every manual and every maintenance briefing as if his life would someday depend on it. And one day, it did. The ripple effect of Calloway's landing extended beyond his own survival. In the years following the war, the Air Force conducted extensive research into emergency decision-making. The goal was to reduce casualties during the next conflict, whenever and wherever it came. The Lucky Streak case became a reference point in these studies. Researchers identified several key factors in Calloway's success. First, his technical knowledge. He understood the aircraft's systems well enough to assess what was still functional and what could be compensated for. Second, his environmental awareness. He scanned the terrain for options rather than fixating on standard procedures. Third, his risk assessment. He calculated that the danger of staying with the aircraft was lower than the danger of bailing out, given the specific conditions. These factors were integrated into updated training protocols. Pilots were taught to prioritize adaptability over rote procedure. They were encouraged to study systems beyond the minimum required knowledge. They were drilled in terrain assessment and creative problem-solving under pressure. The results were measurable. During the Korean War, the rate of successful emergency landings increased. Pilots reported feeling better prepared for off-script scenarios. Post-mission debriefs frequently cited the training emphasis on adaptive thinking. But the influence went further. Civilian aviation also took note. In the 1950s and 60s, as commercial air travel expanded rapidly, airlines faced a new challenge. Pilots trained in military discipline sometimes struggled to adapt when automation failed or when weather and mechanical issues converged. The solution was a training philosophy borrowed from military case studies, including Calloway's. Modern crew resource management, the framework that governs cockpit decision-making today, has roots in this era. The principle is simple. When systems fail, human judgment must fill the gap, and human judgment is only as good as the preparation behind it. Calloway never knew about any of this. He lived a quiet life, far from the institutions that studied his actions. But his decision on that March afternoon in 1945 became a data point in a larger evolution. It helped shift aviation culture away from the belief that great pilots were born, not made. It reinforced the idea that preparation, knowledge, and calm analysis could outperform instinct. His crew certainly understood the impact. The 8 men who survived went on to live full lives. They became teachers, engineers, salesmen, fathers. Several stayed in touch over the decades. At reunions, they would talk about the war, about the friends they lost, about the missions they flew. And they always talked about the landing, about the moment they thought they were dead, and then they were not, about the shy co-pilot who had saved them without fanfare, without hesitation, without ever asking for recognition. One of them, the bombardier, said it best in a letter written in 1989. Jim never acted like a hero, but he was one, not because he was fearless, but because he was thorough. He knew his job better than anyone gave him credit for. And when the moment came, that made all the difference. In 2011, a group of aviation students from Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University traveled to Germany as part of a historical study program. Their itinerary included visits to former air bases, museums, and crash sites from the Second World War. One of the students had read Pritchard's book. He knew the approximate location where Lucky Streak had gone down. Using wartime maps and local records, the group found the road. It was still there, wider now, paved with modern asphalt. The fields on either side were cultivated with wheat. The telephone poles were gone. There was no marker, no plaque, nothing to indicate that 70 years earlier a crippled bomber had skidded to a halt there, its crew battered but alive. The students stood on the roadside and tried to imagine it. The sound of engines failing, the wind screaming through shattered glass, the ground rushing up, the impossible geometry of threading a four-engine bomber onto a narrow strip of pavement. One of them asked the guide, a local historian, if anyone in the area remembered the incident. The guide said that a few of the oldest villagers had stories passed down from their parents. A plane had crashed or landed, depending on who told it. American soldiers had been taken prisoner. No one had died in the village, which was all that mattered at the time. The students took photographs. They measured the width of the road. They calculated the approach angle. Back at the university, they built a simulation based on the available data. They tried to replicate the landing. Most attempts ended in a crash. The margin for error was razor-thin. A few degrees too steep, and the airframe broke apart. A few knots too fast, and the plane overshot into the trees. The successful runs required precise timing, exact control inputs, and a level of situational awareness that the simulation struggled to model. The conclusion was unanimous. What Calloway had done was not impossible, but it was improbable. It required skill, yes, but also a kind of focus that could not be taught, only cultivated. This is the legacy. Not that one man was extraordinary, but that preparation and clarity can produce extraordinary results, that the quiet ones, the overlooked ones, the ones who ask too many questions and read too many manuals, are often the ones who solve the unsolvable. James Calloway did not set out to be a hero. He set out to be competent. He wanted to understand his aircraft, his job, his role. He did not seek glory or recognition. He simply believed that if he was going to be responsible for other people's lives, he should know how to keep them alive. That belief, applied consistently over months of training and preparation, became the foundation for 90 seconds of decisive action. And those 90 seconds saved 8 men. There is a tendency in storytelling to mythologize such moments, to frame them as destiny or fate. But the truth is more instructive. Calloway succeeded because he had done the work. He had built a reservoir of knowledge and skill that he could draw on when panic was not an option. His story is not about natural talent. It is about deliberate effort. It is about the thousands of small decisions, reading one more page, asking one more question, double-checking one more time, that accumulate into competence. And competence, when the moment demands it, becomes heroism. In the end, the shy cadet who was mocked for being too cautious, too methodical, too quiet, proved that those qualities were not weaknesses. They were strengths, hidden until the moment they were needed most. The war produced many heroes, some loud, some brash, some celebrated, but it also produced people like James Calloway, people who did not seek the spotlight, but who, when everything fell apart, became the light that others followed home. His lesson is simple. Prepare for the moment you hope never comes. Learn beyond what is required. Trust that knowledge when fear tries to drown it out. And remember that courage is not the absence of fear. It is the refusal to let fear make your decisions. Panic is just noise, and noise doesn't solve problems.